Hello again, everybody, and welcome to the LSU Sports Insider podcast for Thursday, May the 29th. I'm Zach Ewing, and joining us live from beautiful Destin, Florida is Scott Rabalais, advocate sports columnist, who is there on the beach in Florida, soaking up the sun and also soaking up all the, boy, I don't even know what the right word is, Rab, soaking up all the politics from the SEC spring meetings.
A lot of words going on. Not much action, but a lot of words.
That is right. That is going to be the main topic of our show today. Not just how this will affect college football, but specifically the SEC and LSU, of course. There's a lot that can change. I mean, this sport never seems to sit still, Rab, which is always funny to me that like college football seems so bound in its own tradition. And yet over the last 30 years or so, they can't keep the same system for more than 3 to 5 years, and they want to change it again. So here we are again. As most of you probably know, there's already been one change to the college football playoff this offseason, and that is that they have gotten rid of the top 4 seeds going to conference champions only. Now it's just going to be a straight 1 through 12 seeding. So, for instance, last year, Oregon would not have had to play Ohio State in the first round. Arizona State and Boise State would not have gotten top 4 seeds and buys. Those would have gone to, your Texas and your Notre Dame and some of those schools. So I think that one was a pretty logical change, Scott, but now we've got a whole bunch of others on the table.
Yeah, when you look back on it, you think, why didn't they do that from the start? Really, it just seems so obvious that it just should be the 4 best teams should be the top 4 seeds. And so this seems like a good change. But to your point, Zach, we had a 4-team playoff in 2023. We had a 12-team playoff last year with the buys, as you said, with the top 4 conference champions. 2025, we've got another set of, seeding criteria. We're just going to go straight seeding. And then next year, 2026 season, after the 2026 season, we could have a 14-team playoff, a 16-team playoff, automatic, set number of automatic qualifiers for the SEC and the Big Ten and the other conferences, top 5 conferences with a bunch of at-larges, top 5 conference champions. So we could, to your point, all the change in college football, we are likely, I think, by next year to have a 4th different system, or at least way of determining your college football playoff in 4 years, which is just, it's just this so much change is going so rapidly in college football. It's like they're not stopping at all to say, let's see how this works for now. Let's just try this on for size and get a bigger sample size. It's just they're pounding it, moving ahead without a lot of thought about it. I think, and a lot without certainly just driven by I don't know what the economics of it. It's hard to exactly say, but
definitely,
but that's what's going on.
The economics of it.
Yeah.
I mean, you're right. It gives you whiplash, and we're not even talking about NIL and whatever legal agreements come out of Congress for how NIL should be governed and how paying players is going to work. Like, we're not even delving into that. Wilson and I had a couple of podcasts on that a few weeks ago. This is just talking about the on-field competitive system for how they decide a championship. Right. And it is enough to, like, I don't even pretty diehard college football fans are going to sit up in September and look at their TVs and say, wait a minute, what? Like, this is different than it was just last year. Now, the real diehards are following our old colleague Ross Dellinger, who does a great job of tracking all this stuff. And like if you follow him, you stay pretty up to date. Although there's so many rumors flying around, even then it's hard to tell what's true and what's not. But I mean, I'm talking about the people who they're big college football fans, but more like from September through January, and then they drop off and they tune back in the next August. Like, they're going to be surprised every year at the different changes. And now, like, it's just hard to keep up with. I will say one of the overarching questions I want to answer with this podcast is how well positioned you think LSU is for all of these changes, no matter what they are. If a lot of big changes go through, if it's more minor tweaks, do you think LSU is in a good spot, both and we can maybe delve into the NIL a little bit here. Although, like I said, Wilson and I, if you want to go back and look at some of our LSU Sports Insider podcast, folks can find those. But just in the playoff era, how well positioned is LSU to compete in this ever changing environment?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think what it boils down to, college football is such a regional, local sport in its essence, and it's like that's what everyone wants to know, right? Is my school going to be competitive in the future? Is my local school, the place I went to school, going to be competitive? And I think for LSU's case, I think you'd have to say, yeah, they're well positioned. First of all, you're in a stable conference. One that has added 2 teams in Texas and Oklahoma to get to 16, obviously. So it's a tougher conference than it was, but it's not going anywhere. It's not going to be pulled apart like the Pac-12 was, right? It's too powerful for that. So that's not a concern. You're one of the power schools in that. LSU's got the money to, we'll touch on the House settlement later, but LSU's got the money to start doing the revenue sharing with the athletes, $20.5 million a year. It's got they've positioned themselves certainly with this school this year's transfer portal cycle, gotten the money to beef up the roster to where Brian Kelly says this is the best team we've had in his tenure at LSU. And him saying that, and I don't see a huge reason to disagree. And they got a big stadium, they've got the tradition, because Zach, all the changes we've talked about, this is not necessarily going to stop. I quoted the former LSU president Michael Martin in my column today, which I've quoted him many times, but this keeps being relevant. He said 10, 12 years ago, he said, one day in college sports, you're going to have 2 conferences, the ESPN conference and the Fox conference. And it looks more and more that way with the SEC and the Big Ten trying to dominate things and trying to bend the rule of law, to lack of a better term, to their will, for all of college athletics, certainly all of big time college athletics. And I think, a bigger question that has to be asked is, there are some people who say we're eventually going to get to some kind of, NFL like model with 30 something schools, 40 something schools, 65 schools or whatever. And if it's smaller than what you have now in the Power Four, it's not everybody's going to have a seat at the table. So you have to think, if you're an LSU fan, is LSU going to have a seat at the table? I think for all the reasons I mentioned, I think they will. But it's an uncertain time for a lot of people in the college game. If I'm a fan of Mississippi State, I'm a little concerned. If I'm a fan of Texas Tech, I'm a little concerned. If I'm a fan of Kentucky in football, I'm a little concerned. So there's a lot of uncertainty out there, and it's hard for us to wrap our arms around it as professionals who follow this. I can just imagine for the average fan. I try to touch base with people like my son Nicholas, who's a big time LSU football fan, and just try to use him as a good gauge to see, where are people getting lost? Because if people start getting lost, if this college football or college sports becomes too much trouble to follow, then that could hurt the sport. And we're a long way from that probably, but it's still something to be concerned about.
Yeah, I think it's important to mention, like, TV ratings still very healthy, maybe better than they've ever been. The interest in college sports is not diminishing by any means. And so I think people will follow. But you do wonder, does that translate to the next generation? Does that translate long term? Because, as you mentioned, college football is a regional sport. One of the beautiful things about college sports is that no matter where you live in the country, you have a team to root for. You can go see, relatively big time sports in your own backyard, even FCS football, right? Like the state of Montana, for instance, 2 great FCS college football teams. North Dakota's got, and then in basketball, they can go play against the big boys. Like, everybody has a chance to go compete and can go see these things in their own backyard. Once you start going to a bigger model and you're saying, okay, we're going to exclude, Mississippi State, as you said, or Texas Tech, or, whatever schools may get left out. I shudder to think what that could do long term, but we're not going to go too big picture today into that. Although I do want to have a discussion at the end about.
We could have an endless discussion about these things.
Yes, yeah. I do want to have a discussion at the end about whether the SEC, the conference LSU has been a member of for, going on 100 years now, and not too far away from that. Like, is the SEC the one driving this more than anyone? Are they trying to grab too much power here? I mean, that's one question I do want to answer. But let's go through some of the changes, and let's start with the CFP. So it looks like expansion to 16 is going to happen as early as 2026, Rab. The major question with that is the SEC and Big Ten are pushing for automatic bids. They would each like to have 4 and give the Big 12 and ACC 2 teams each. You do the math, that's 12 teams. There'd be 1 automatic bid for the group of 5, as there is now, and then there would be 3 kind of at-large teams at the end that could be additional teams from any of those areas. So I know
with Notre Dame qualifying if they reach a certain threshold of the ranking.
Okay, yeah. Good caveat. Yeah, Notre Dame would be involved as well. So let's. I know we've talked before about the automatic bids. I don't think either one of us likes that idea. Like the SEC. What I just don't understand is the way things go, and this goes for the Big Ten too. The way things are going right now, there's never ever going to be a year where those conferences don't have 4 teams in the top 16. I just don't see it. In fact, most years they're going to have more than that. So I don't know why they are so dead set on getting those 4, but that's a big sticking point for them. And it's sort of the central focus of this argument in college football surrounding the playoff.
Yes, I'm in agreement with that. I think that's not, again, you said there's a lot to talk about, and then you get into a specific issue, and there's a lot to talk about. Right. So I'll try to be as succinct as I can as I nail the wire to my headphones and jerk the screen. Sorry, folks. The college football playoff looks likely to expand by next year. And the SEC and the Big Ten have most of the say in what will be going on. Going forward. If it expands, those conferences have kind of taken the position they want these 4 automatic qualifiers each, which is half the field, obviously, and then you could, they could get more teams. You're not just limited to 4. During the week here, though, there's been a little more talk. The football coaches seem a little more interested in the 5-11 model, which is the top 5 ranked conference champions get automatic bids, and then there's 11 at larges, which again it would seem to, as you said, you're going to end up populated with a lot of SEC and Big Ten teams under that scenario as well. The thing that the SEC people have a gripe about from last year, and again, they're changing the criteria again, they're changing the seeding and all this stuff, is that they felt like schools like Indiana, got in over Alabama, Ole Miss, and South Carolina. That at least one of those schools should have been in, even though they had more losses. And saying that not all losses are equal. They're just looking at, as Brian Kelly said, the right-hand column. The selection committee were just looking at the right-hand column, and Indiana only had only one loss during the regular season. They didn't play as many tough games. But then you and that's true. And did Alabama have a tougher go in the SEC? Yeah, that's true. But I'm just looking specifically at Alabama. They lost to Oklahoma, who had a middling year, and they lost to Vandy, and they had some losses that were kind of not great. So yeah, they played a tougher schedule. Maybe the eyeball test tells you Alabama was a better team with Jalen Milroe and all those guys than Indiana, but it's not necessarily who's more deserving or what's more fair. I think it's what it comes down to, and they're not the same argument. So that's where this impetus for or this drive for automatic qualifiers is coming from. But again, I kind of thought they'd be moving towards that consensus, and then we'll see what Greg Sankey tells us today after we meet with him this afternoon after they finish their general business session with all the school presidents and chancellors. We'll see what he says, if anything, then. But there seems to be at least more interest in the 5-11 model, which might be something that the other conferences like more. But we don't know. We don't know. It's probably going to be December before they decide what the whole the model is for 2026 and beyond. And so there's a long way to go until then, obviously. And but it's this whole stair-step thing. I know we're going to get into this, but just real quickly, everybody's waiting for the House settlement to come out, which determines the revenue sharing situation. That was supposed to have come out last week. They're still waiting today. Could be any minute. Could be next week. Nobody knows. Then that will impact the college football playoff going forward, and that's going to impact SEC scheduling going forward. So it's like it's a domino it's a domino effect kind of thing.
Right. And I mean, I think I'm going to put you on the spot here in a second with a prediction, but that's really the first domino that has to fall. I will say this. I mean, I think Greg Sankey came out, what was it, Tuesday, and kind of had a very angry, by his standards anyway. He wasn't pounding the table Brian Kelly style or anything, but Sankey's usually very mild mannered in these interviews, and he got pretty passionate when asked about what was, quote, good for the game. And it was in response to a press release put out by the Big 12 and ACC saying, we're willing to make changes that are good for the game, not just for our conference, which is sort of like the subtext there, of course, is that the SEC and Big 10 are not doing what's for the good of the game. They're only doing what's best for their conference. And Sankey really pushed back against that idea, I think, in kind of two ways, saying, one, everybody's doing what's best for their conference because that's what our job is. But two, how dare you say I'm not doing what's good for the game when I've done this, this, and this, and laying out some examples. So I think he's at least cognizant of that as he goes forward. But I would ask you this, Rab, when do you think this is resolved? And I know the House settlement probably needs to come first before any total decisions are made, because that affects revenue and TV deals and those sorts of things. But when do you think this is resolved, and what do you think the next iteration of the college football playoff in 2026 looks like?
Boy, those are really loaded questions. That's okay. One thing with all of this that I have allowed myself to do is to the possibility of being wrong. Just saying, I'm going to say this or I believe that, and then just might totally be something else.
Nobody's bet 1,000 in these things.
Nobody knows for sure. There's no one. Like, we had some heavy hitters, national media people here this week, and no one is telling someone else, look, I know this is exactly what's going to happen. Let me tell you. There hasn't been that, because no one truly knows. And Scott Woodward sat down with me yesterday and said, I don't know. He was being truthful. I really think. But I think the playoff will expand to 16 teams. That seems to be the model. You hear 14, and that could be. But if I had to predict, I would say it's going to 16 teams. It's interesting that the coaches, if they can get the ADs on board with the 5-11 model, that they might go for that. It just seems like they've been so hell bent on the 4 automatic qualifiers for the SEC and the other conferences, and they're right. Like, everybody's right and everybody's wrong to a degree. It is Greg Sankey's job to look out for the SEC. It is the Mississippi State President Keenum, who's involved in the college football playoff, board of governors, whatever they call it, to look out for his school, and they probably are worried about with conference scheduling, not going to 9 games, because it makes it harder for them to be bowl eligible. And that's important to them. Yeah, they realize where they are, and that they're probably going to be a school that's looking more often to get into a bowl than the college football playoff, assuming bowls continue to exist. And so, I guess I'm still thinking that 16 teams with the 4-4-2-2 3-1 situation, like you described earlier, is what's most likely to happen. But I'm not confident in that prediction whatsoever.
So with that caveat, we're thinking that the SEC will end up getting its way. I want to take a quick break here, but when we come back, we're going to talk SEC scheduling. We're going to touch on that House settlement and what it might mean, and then also look at the big picture question of, is the SEC in the right here? Is the SEC justified in what it's doing, or has the conference gone too far? We're on the LSU Sports Insider, visiting live with Scott Rabalais from the SEC spring meetings in Destin, and we'll be back right after this.
There's no better place to parlay than Caesars Sportsbook. With quick picks, you can tap right into pre-built, ready-to-bet parlays right from the home screen. And if you miss tip-off, no worries. You can play same-game parlays live during the action. Plus, it's never been easier to find and bet on the biggest matchups of the day, so you can keep up with all the action. Caesars Sportsbook, proud partner of the NBA and the only sportsbook app with Caesars Rewards. Download it today.
All right, welcome back to the LSU Sports Insider. Zach Ewing visiting with Scott Rabalais on this Thursday. He is in Destin for the SEC spring meetings. There's always something going on at those spring meetings. This year seems particularly like a sea change out there. And we've been talking about the CFP, the expansion of it for 2026, what we expect that to look like. Still don't know. Also, still don't know, and this one's almost a little crazier to me. We still don't have a 2026 SEC football schedule. We don't know the opponents that every team will play. I mean, this 16-team SEC was sort of thrown together. I don't want to say it was last minute because there was planning, but they could not essentially come to a decision on a schedule for every team. And so what the SEC did was they just came up with 2 years worth of schedule. And those are the teams everybody played last year in 2024. And then you'll play the reverse of that this year. So for LSU, this year they're at Vanderbilt, at Oklahoma, at Alabama, and at Ole Miss. And their home games will be the inverse of their road games from last year. So Florida, Texas A&M, South Carolina, and blanking on the Arkansas. Those will be their 8 SEC games. We don't know what it looks like after that. There's no rotation in place. We don't even know, Scott, if it's going to be 8 games or 9 games. There's also this issue of which rivalries do you preserve and try to play as often as possible. Obviously, in a 16-team conference, the more rivalries you preserve, then the more years will go by before you even play a team. Like you might, if you want to preserve 3 rivalries, well, then LSU might not play Missouri for 6 years at a time. I mean, there is going to be a give and take there. And then the other half of this is that there is possibly an agreement to play a non-conference game with the Big Ten every year as part of a schedule too. And so then that you've got some coaches who say, well, let's play 8 SEC games plus the Big Ten game. And then other coaches and ADs who will say, let's play 9 SEC games plus the Big Ten game. Everybody, let's go play a big, difficult schedule and measure where we're at.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's like one domino has to fall after another. So, but the SEC, and I'm just going by what Scott Woodward said to me yesterday. So he thinks that the SEC will come up with a scheduling format for at least for 2026, sometime this summer. Certainly not leaving here with one, but sometime this summer, well before the deadline for, as I mentioned earlier, for deciding on a CFP format for 2026. Now, again, as you said, they just created a stopgap schedule for 2024 and 2025 with the 8 games and just flipping the home games. They can just do a stopgap schedule again for another 2 years or just for next year or whatever. It doesn't have to be something like we're going to do this for the next 10 to 12 years. It doesn't have to be that. I think everybody's kind of thinking that, but it doesn't have to be that. So the 2 big models out there are staying with 8 games, and then before the talk a couple of years ago was that you'd have 1 permanent opponent, and then with 9 games you'd have 3 permanent opponents. For LSU, the 1 permanent opponent would probably be Texas A&M, I would think, because Texas doesn't want to stop playing OU every year in Dallas. And then if it was the 9-game schedule with 3 permanent opponents, I was told it would be Alabama, Ole Miss, and Texas A&M. And then you would play you rotate the other teams, and you play everyone in a 4-year span. Now there's been talk this week, gaining traction. It's staying with an 8-game schedule, but maybe protecting 2 rivalries, a primary rivalry and a secondary rivalry. It's always very interesting for LSU because, as I've said, I'm sure on this podcast, and I've certainly written it, LSU does not have a rival who does not have a bigger rival in the SEC. Ole Miss has Mississippi State. Alabama has Auburn. Texas A&M has Texas. We can go on down the list. The only one that's they tried to force together a rivalry between LSU and Arkansas playing the last game of the season, but now Arkansas plays Missouri, and that's kind of a rivalry, I guess. I mean, LSU and Arkansas is kind of a rivalry. They play for the boot and all that stuff, but LSU is going to win that game 7 out of 10, most likely.
It doesn't feel like one fans are going to get into as much.
No, certainly not as much as Alabama or A&M. Yeah, and so LSU and Oklahoma are playing the last game of the season for the second straight year because Oklahoma is kind of in a similar boat. They don't have, they're not playing Oklahoma State. And I was told by Barry Trammell, the columnist from the Tulsa World, that he said it doesn't look like they're going to play anytime soon because Oklahoma State's mad about OU leaving the Big 12 primarily. So might they keep playing each other? I don't know. I know the LSU people want 9 games, but it becomes problematic because you have schools like South Carolina plays Clemson every year, and they want to keep playing Clemson. And Florida plays Florida State every year, and they want to keep playing Florida State. And so there's a few schools that have these big out-of-conference, Kentucky and Louisville, for that matter. A few schools have these big out-of-conference in-state rivalries that they want to keep playing, and they're like, "Whoa, you want us to play this 8 or 9 game SEC schedule and one of these Power 5 teams that we always play, and the team from the Big Ten?" You know, that's a lot. So if you did 9 game, just imagine that 9 games, 9 SEC for a team like South Carolina, 9 games in the SEC. A game with Clemson, a game with a Big Ten team. Let's just pick one. Let's just say Penn State, and then one. They got one game that's a tomato game.
One bye game, basically. Yeah.
Or one rent-a-win. That's a schedule. That's a tough schedule. So you can see some of the pushback, and I think I think the Big Ten thing, though. By the way, I wrote about it today because Brian Kelly said it, and because he's the one who said it, that the coaches are in support of it. I think they're a long way from getting that done. The impression I get from getting some kind of scheduling thing done with the Big Ten, but it has been talked about for a while now, especially as these two conferences try to come together and. They're the two superpowers, right? They're trying to, rule the world in college athletics. So it's possible, but I don't think it's happening next year. I'd be surprised if we see all of a sudden LSU is going to play Michigan finally. There's 3 teams from the Big Ten LSU's never played: Michigan, Northwestern, and Minnesota. Michigan, of course, being the big one. And so we'll see if that ever comes to pass. But I don't know. It's that's a hard one to predict as well, where the scheduling format lands.
Yeah. And I'm going to put you on the spot there too in a minute. Don't worry about that. But
I would have been disappointed.
I will say, like this is where the two discussions tie together, right? Because if we're giving out 4 automatic bids to the SEC and the Big Ten, what is the point of an SEC versus Big Ten? I mean, it could come into play for those 3 at-large spots. It could. But if Notre Dame is having a good year, you're only looking at 2 at-large spots. And my inclination is to think that a committee is going to look more at a 3rd place team from an ACC or Big 12 that, like you said, has fewer losses in the loss column than a 5th place team from the SEC or Big 10. And so I guess maybe that could make a difference, but most of those games are going to be played for seeding. They're going to feel more like exhibitions. Like if you are locking in 4 teams from each conference, I don't know that those crossover games carry as much weight. Now in the 5+11 model, they would carry a ton of weight because you would want to win that game, and you would want your conference mates to win as many of those games as possible to pump up your conference's strength of schedule over the other conference and the at-large bid. So that's certainly a big part. But I hear what you're saying about, boy, for some of these teams, like South Carolina is a great example because Clemson is their traditional rivalry, whom they play every year. You add that to a Big Ten game, to a 9-game SEC schedule. South Carolina had a very good team last year. They're probably going to have a very good team this year. They don't always have a very good team. This is a program that would be struggling to get to the 6 wins necessary just to make a bowl game most years with that schedule. You would have to be a good team just to go 7-5 against that schedule. So I don't know. It certainly changes the way teams will think about their seasons. I know you wrote a column saying the era of the undefeated team in college football is most likely over. Maybe we'll see a great team at some point in the future do it and get lucky a couple of times. And like Ohio State could have done it last year, right? Like both of the games they lost came right down to the wire. They could have possibly gone undefeated, but it's less and less likely. And then also you start to look at 1 and 2 loss seasons in a whole nother light where, hey, if we just lose once or twice, that's now a great season.
Yeah, it gets college football gets more and more like the NFL, where we've seen 9. Now they play 17 games, but we've seen 9 and 7 teams win the Super Bowl, right? I mean, just get in the playoff, get that wild card bid, and then try to advance in each game and see if you can win the ultimate game. And we've seen that. You could see a 9 and 8 team win the Super Bowl. It wouldn't be a stretch, and we're going to see 2-loss, 3-loss, maybe even a 4-loss, team, especially from the SEC or the Big Ten, make the college football playoff, one day, especially if it's 16 teams, because you're gonna have to, have some teams with some losses, obviously. So yeah, it's a very interesting dynamic, and I know the LSU perspective is that they're thinking, well, we can be a power. The LSU is thinking it can continue to be a power, and even with a tough schedule, and still be in the mix of these, the upper half of the SEC, and they're playing one less rent-a-win at home, one less home game that people don't want to see. because you're playing that extra SEC. Now, not every year, obviously. Obviously, one year you're going to play 5 SEC home games, the next year you're going to play 4. So you are going to have maybe have to finagle your schedule a little more carefully in that respect. But are you asking me yet to predict what the SEC will do?
Let's do that.
Right.
When do you think we get a 2026 SEC schedule? What do you think it will? What format do you think it will be? And then I'll throw in the bonus question: do you think this will be more or less the quasi-permanent rotation going forward?
Yes.
Or do you think we're looking for another change?
Yes, I think if Scott Woodward said that it's going to happen sometime this summer, I think it will happen sometime this summer. I think it's not going. I think it's going to be another kind of stopgap thing, or it's going to be just for 26 or 26 and 27. And I think it's still going to be 8 games. I think there's enough pressure from enough schools that are like worried about, because they're not going to know what the college football playoff format's going to be, most likely. Almost certainly.
Yeah.
But if they come up with a scheduling format this summer, and you can't wait till December to tell. College football. Football schedules need to be set farther in advance than that. It's you can't wait till
Sure.
the college football playoff format is set. So I'm going to say 8 games. It's not going to be permanent again. They're still going to do something just for 1 or 2 years, but maybe with a caveat. We might see something about the permanent rivalry, or primary rivalries. That every school has the one school that they're looking to play every year and designated that team, because we didn't have that this year. And I mean, obviously, these first 2 years with Texas and OU in the league, obviously they did preserve those things. Alabama's playing Auburn, of course. Texas and Oklahoma are playing. Texas and Texas A&M are playing.
There are some we'll never get rid of. Yeah.
But see, but if you stay with 8 games and try to preserve, let's say, 2 rivalries, you're not going to get to where you play everyone in 4 years, which is something they seem to be very interested in doing at the outset with Texas and Oklahoma joining the league. Mm-hmm. If LSU plays Texas A&M and let's say Ole Miss every year, well, they're not going to play. It's going to be harder. It's going to take longer to get to everyone.
Sure.
In the rest of the conference, because you go home and home back-to-back years. You play somebody at home, then 2 years later you play them away, and you play. It's all kind of permutations that you can have. But that's my prediction. Another kind of temporary schedule, 8 games, but maybe with a caveat about rivalries.
Okay. Well, we will look for that this summer. This is the LSU Sports Insider podcast, visiting with Scott Rabalais as he sits in the hotel lobby there at the SEC spring meetings in Destin. Encourage everybody to subscribe to our LSU Sports at NOLA.com YouTube channel and our LSU Sports Insider podcast there on YouTube or Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And while you're there on YouTube, hit the like button for us. I know a lot of people watch on Facebook, but it's easier for us to see your comments, easier for us to track who's watching and for how long on YouTube. So we appreciate you all being over there if you don't mind making that switch. I want to end this discussion with sort of this big picture look. I think there's a lot of sort of hand wringing out there about how college football is being ruined. I am personally of the opinion that that's a little bit of overblown talk. I mean, again, TV ratings have never been better. Attendance has never been better. Like, donations have never been higher. Everybody still loves college athletics and college football in particular. So I don't think the sport is being ruined, although I do worry long-term about how people, are going to deal with all the changes. So my question for you, Rab, is, the Big Ten and especially the SEC are seen as kind of the big bad wolves in the room who are just making everybody else kowtow to their will. How much truth is there to that, and how far do you think the SEC is willing to go with this?
I definitely think these two conferences see that they can't overcome the other, and that they got to try to do this kind of jointly, and that they want things to be done the way they want them. And, that for a long time, the NCAA Division I, and remember, when you're talking about Division I, we're not talking just like football. The Football Bowl subdivision part of football, which is 130 teams, basically. I don't know what the exact number is this year, but in Division I, you're talking about well over 300 schools, and they got sick and tired of being judged, being legislated and ruled, and living by the same rule book at LSU that they live by at, and I don't want to pick on Nicholls State, but Nicholls State, right? Schools that have vastly different resources and vastly different budgets compete on vastly different level, playing fields, and only really, end up competing against each other, on occasion, maybe, Nichols will be a team in a regional at Baton Rouge, or for baseball, or, things like that. So they got really tired of that, and obviously we're not going back to that, and obviously the NCAA has created a power vacuum, right? I mean, the NCAA used to be so, the rule book, as Dale Brown said, Dale Brown famously said, the former LSU basketball coach, we can't follow the 10 Commandments, which you can put on an index card. And they got this rule book that's this thick. They want us to follow that,
Mm-hmm.
and it's true. So the NCAA is kind of like, fine, you guys make the rules. And so there's an opportunity there for these schools to create things the way they want. And they say they're doing everything for the best interest of college sports, but I think that's some lip service, and personally. Now, again, if you're an LSU fan, saying, "Well, I want my school to be in the most powerful or the most powerful conference to make sure that going forward, they continue to be a power, a relevant school from a small state, obviously Louisiana, right, compared to some of these other states." And so I get that, and you're in a much better position than University of Houston is, or to again mention Texas Tech or SMU, which got made the playoff last year, and they're not in the ACC, so SMU is not a great example. But I'm talking about like a Big 12 school or something like that. Yeah, I just feel like they say they've got the interests of college athletics at heart, but it's everyone is operating, even the SEC, Zach, is operating out of a position of fear that you're going to get left out, fear that you're not going to have the resources to compete on the level you want to, fear that whatever is happening, that you're not going to be part of the big TV contract or whatever. And that's not a great place to be operating from. Competition is one thing, but fear is another thing. And I think everyone's kind of driven by fear right now in college athletics because they don't exactly know what's going on. Kim Mulkey said to me, we're figuring out the instruments while we're flying the plane.
Mm-hmm.
And it's leading to very hasty decisions. And also we've just pulling apart the fabric of college athletics and college football. And to some people, I know that, radio talk show hosts in Baton Rouge, and there's a lot of fans out there say, I don't care about Oklahoma State playing. I don't care about Oregon State playing. I don't care about Washington State playing. And okay, that's fair. But it's all those things that make up, at its core, college athletics is regional and in state and state rivals and regional rivals and that sort of thing. And you start pulling those things apart, what do you have left? And I fear that eventually, that 20 years from now, people are going to just sit back and say, what have we done? What have we done to college sports? Because this doesn't exist in a lot of other countries, right? I mean, college athletics on this level is very unique to the United States.
Sure.
Right. So many, as evidenced by so many college athletes coming from other countries to compete in so many sports in the United States. So it's not something that is, unassailable. It's not something that is just impervious to being, pulled apart. And there's so many pressures with the paying the athletes now and all this stuff. So many changes. Just think of all the changes that have happened since LSU won the national championship with Joe Burrow in January 2020. We had the pandemic, and it just seems like we've been on a fast forward process since then. Just going fast forward, and sometimes it's like going down the highway at 70 miles an hour, and they have those highway road signs, those historical markers. Well, you can't read one if you're going 70 miles an hour, right? I feel that's what's going on in college athletics.
Like I want to get off this ride. I need a rest area at least for a little while. I mean, I tend to agree with you. I think, while not impervious, college athletics are very resilient because people do love them so much, and people feel those almost like tribal affinity for their school. And so I think that will withstand a lot. Will it withstand everything? I don't know. And I do, I think we should make the point. LSU is in a good position no matter what. We said that at the beginning. No matter what
as
happens,
good as anyone.
yeah, LSU is
I think
a
so.
very strong member of a very strong conference, probably the strongest conference. I know the Big Ten has won the last 2 national titles, but if we're being just completely objective about it, I think the SEC, at least in football, is in a better spot than the Big Ten. And LSU is in the top half of that conference. Like that program is going to be on solid footing of anyone. Now, my question would be, and people can leave their thoughts in the comments or however they want to do this. My question would be, are you okay with any sort of change as long as LSU winds up in a good competitive place? Or is there something that would bother you? Maybe it's not whether Oklahoma and Oklahoma State or Cal and Stanford play. Maybe you don't care about that. But is there something else that you would care about? Would you pull the plug on cheering for LSU, or at least not be quite so passionate about it if it was a 40-team Super League and all of a sudden LSU didn't play Mississippi State anymore because they weren't in the same division? Or in a March Madness type environment, you wouldn't get a Princeton over UCLA upset because those teams wouldn't ever play each other. I mean, at what point would you say that's too much? I'm not going to follow this anymore. Or maybe you follow it a little bit and still kind of, check the scores and root for LSU when you see them on TV, but you're not following it to the point where your children would start to get into it. And then, as I said earlier, like a generation down the road, that fandom really does start to die off because children aren't growing up with their parents watching games on every weekend on TV or going out to Tiger Stadium. Like that, to me, there has to be a point where we say, this has gone too far. And Rab, I don't know that I see anyone, Greg Sankey included, like who knows where that point is or is willing to slow down and find it.
That's exactly right. They're just everybody's trying to get the best deal, figure out the best TV contract, get the most teams in the playoff, and I get there's merit to that. Yeah, when SEC coaches say, well, look at the NCAA basketball tournament. 14 SEC teams got in, right? Look at NCAA gymnastics, which I cover a lot. SEC only has 9 teams, but they're all in the NCAA championship. Similar thing for women's basketball and in baseball. I'm not sure how many of the teams got in, but it's the vast majority, right? Only
13, I think, of the 16.
13. I was going to say it's pretty close to it's like 3/4 or so. So yeah, and so they're like, if you're the best football league or one of the 2 best football leagues, why shouldn't you have the most teams? I think it'll take care of itself. But we don't see those qualifiers in there, and it has to be mandated. That I don't think the SEC needs that, and I think I think it sells the whole thing short if you're trying to do that. But they're at the top of the heap right now, but it doesn't mean it's always going to be that way. If I may interject something, I remember I was very interested in the 1984 Olympics were in Los Angeles, and they sold. There was no internet. It was well before the internet, right? They sold tickets at Sears stores around the country because they were like Sears stores had more reach than even like the post office. Okay, I mean every time it's got a post office, but what I'm saying, like some places you could do business and stuff. There were big Sears stores and there were small town Sears stores. Everywhere. And where's Sears today? Obviously, it's they've been gobbled up by an Amazon. Well, Amazon is dominant. Well, they're dominant now. Maybe something else will come along and be more dominant in 20 or 30 years. I don't know. So I don't think the SEC and the Big Ten should operate from the point of view that they're on top and always will be so, because that's not the nature of things.
Yeah, and maybe that's a good place for us to wrap it up. I mean, this is a cyclical thing. Sports are cyclical anyway. And you never know. And maybe the SEC is just trying to take advantage of this period in which it is on top. And I tell my kids this, it's not selfish to look out for yourself, because sometimes no one else is going to if you don't. And that is true. And I think these conferences should look out for themselves. But I do think there has to be at some point a limit where people step back and say, at what point are we hurting the overall product long term to the point where, they say a rising tide lifts all boats. Well, I don't think tides sink, but if a sinking tide would sink all boats, right? So it's a falling tide, I guess you'd say, a falling tide would sink all boats. Like I think that there needs to be some big picture, like adult in the room behavior. And I'm not accusing Greg Sankey of not ever doing that. I think he does. But I am curious to see where it goes and some changes. And we may, you got to get off to a Greg Sankey press conference. You may learn something just this afternoon. Real quick before we go, Rab, anything else?
He just went through the room, by the way. Off
okay.
camera.
Well,
behind with a big pile of papers under his arm.
Is there any, the secrets are in those papers,
right?
Is there anything else you would want to discuss from the SEC meetings or that stuck out to you that we haven't covered here?
No, I think we got just about all the house settlement. I think there's a couple of things, just a couple of minor things. Women's basketball is apparently staying with a 16-game schedule. There was talk of going to 18 like the men, but they decided to stay with that schedule. Thought we might hear about some championship locations, but there's talk of a permanent location for softball. Right now they rotate around different home stadiums around the league, which obviously has become taking a lot longer to get around to everybody now because 15 of the 16 teams play. Vandy doesn't play. Waiting to hear about the 2020. So type of things we're waiting for 2026 that have interest to LSU fans. The 2026 SEC Gymnastics Championships, where that's going to be held.
All right.
That's something that's going to come out this summer. But a few housekeeping things like that. But nothing more significant than that. And it's just like I said, everyone's waiting with bated breath for that house settlement, and then we'll see how the other dominoes fall.
All right. Well, we will let you get to that Sankey press conference. You can read all of Scott's work from Destin there at theadvocate.com/LSU. And then as far as the LSU Sports Insider, we will have post-game shows for you from the box all weekend, starting after LSU plays Little Rock in its regional opener tomorrow afternoon. So we appreciate you watching, listening, however that may be. Share the show, hit the like button for us, and we will see you tomorrow with the post-game show from LSU and Little Rock. For Scott Rabalais, I'm Zach Ewing. Thank you for watching the LSU Sports Insider.